Hi, this is Keith Hoover, president of Black Swan Textiles. In this session, we're going to cover return on investment, counting the cost of your color process. Just as background, here are the brands for whom I've set up color management processes over the course of my career. We went from rather a chaotic approach to color management to a much more streamlined and effective process. I'm also a member of AATCC, a trade organization involved in color management in the industry, and ARM, Advanced Robotics for Manufacturing, consortium of groups that are driving AI and robotic manufacturing with our focus on apparel robotic manufacturing. So when we look at a new technology, when we look at investing in something for the organization, we have to set up some criteria. What are we looking for? So in this case, I think there's four things that an organization needs to evaluate when assessing new technology and new processes. First, can that technology allow your designers to choose better colors? We've covered the importance of color in previous sessions. So can this technology actually meet that requirement? Second, can it make a more efficient process? Can it take away time that was previously devoted to this task? And can it add it back in so that designers can focus on more value-adding tasks? Third, can we drive efficiency and eliminate waste for our supply chain? Granted, brands don't own their supply chain, but they do acquire fabric for use in their garments. So any inefficiency or problem that they drive into the supply chain ends up costing them money. And last, an important metric involving the quality of your product. Can you guarantee the shade of all the garments that are manufactured for resale? So these are the KPIs, the key performance indicators that I think are important for assessing technology. In the session today, we're going to review the problem of texture and how LEDSimulator solves it. We'll then go into the money. We'll talk about the value and the cost of color and the three phases: exploration, specification, and production that impact it. And then we'll look at how LEDSimulator can drive savings, and then we'll end up with discussing what we've heard and answering questions. So just to review, the problem with texture is that it impacts the way we perceive color. In this particular garment, we see both color and texture. The texture causes shadows, it causes an impact on the pure color. That pure color, that bright yellow that we see, if we pulled a yarn out of that sweater, this is the color we would see. However, when we factor in the shadows caused by texture of ribs, there is a graying effect, a dulling effect on the overall appearance of the product. Now, the instruments that we use in the apparel industry to measure color tend to blend in the color and the impact of appearance. So they merge this data together and tell us that this is the actual color when we know it's not. You can't blend, you can't mush all those things together and come up with that. That's not how our brain works. So we typically do not use color instrumentation for comparing heavily textured fabrics to a digital standard. They're out of scope for digital processes, so appearance presents a big problem in color management. LEDSimulator, our solution, looks like a light box, but you'll notice in that light box there's an aperture or a square opening in the back of that light box, through which the designer who's sitting in front of it can view what's in back of the light box, what's behind it. What's behind it? Well, there's two LED panels that jut off the corners of the box, about 20 inches by 20 inches. They emit light that is very controlled lighting generated by this technology onto a board that sits parallel to the back of the light box. And on that board, we mount a piece of textured fabric, in this case, terry cloth, that will eventually be illuminated by these LED panels. So that, in essence, is what the designer is seeing as he or she peers through the back of the light box. Through that square opening, they see the fabric. So the process of exploring color, creating a color, involves the colorway interface, where the designer chooses a color, goes through 3 steps to end up with that perfect color. They click a button, and voila, a signal is sent to the box. The lights generate a very specific shade of color that illuminates the textured fabric that is viewed by the designer through that square opening in the back of the box. So this is a technology that allows a designer to choose a color on a computer screen, but then emit that color onto a very textured physical fabric. This is not on-screen color. This is actually colored fabric. Now we're also capturing the pure color, taking out the impact of the texture so that that color can be used in various processes as well. But the important thing in the exploration process is for a designer not only to choose that pure color, but to see how various textured fabrics will be impacted when that color is applied, to evaluate total appearance. So let's look at the value of color. This is where money comes in. There are 3 phases of color that drive cost into the overall process. First is exploration, which we just covered. Second is specification. Once I have that beautiful color, how do I get it into my systems? But more importantly, what process do I use to get that color onto the fabrics that will eventually go into the products? And third, production. What is the impact of this color process on overall production, quality, speed, and cost? Color development, this overall process from which these 3 phases are driven, across the industry tends to be long and complicated. I've seen this process done at many different brands, and although they each have their own take on it, it's basically the same thing. It goes like this. The trend group travels the world, looks at resources to figure out, try to predict what a good color story will be like in a year. What colors and ranges of colors will attract the customer? They then hand this work off to the design group, who basically chooses the specific colors that make up the palette. And that palette defines the colors that all products will be used for. In essence, they're narrowing down the broad strategy that the trend group started. Once they choose their colors, once they create a palette, that information is added to a PLM system or some system of record, perhaps Excel, that is communicated to sourcing, to the garment factory, and eventually to the mill. So already we have a lengthy process just in the creation and specification of colors. Once that color gets to the mill, then the fun begins. They create lab dips trying to match this color, send those lab dips back through that communication chain so the designer sees it. Designer assesses whether or not they like it. They usually don't. Then they reject it. More lab dips are started, and the process goes round and round until such time that either a designer accepts a match from a mill or you run out of time. But at the end of the day, those colors have to be approved in order for purchase orders to be issued and production to begin. Now, when you're assessing your color process, we're talking budgets here. Do you know how much your process costs? You know what you're paying now? This should be addressed more than once a year because it impacts the efficiency of your company. The process that you have within your organization is impacted by many things: people, expectations, the way things have always been done, what you hear about from other companies. So it's important to document your process, and it's also important to understand what your process, how it impacts your supply chain, because any cost that you drive into your supply chain goes back against your bottom line. So for today, we're going to outline those KPIs. We're going to put some measures against them, and then I'm going to share some information that I was able to derive from a major brand, Brand X, who will go unnamed other than Brand X, and we'll put those numbers in context to show the scale of how they impact the business. The buckets, the cost buckets that we look at for the brand: people. Everything starts with people. Those people tend to want to travel, and although we're living in a time of COVID, it will soon be over, and they'll be traveling again. They will be back at the trade shows, back at the offices, back wherever they do their research. The overall time of the process is certainly important because time is money. The equipment that is required for the organization, plus other resources, replenishables, things that are used in the day-to-day operation. These are the basic buckets that we're going to look at. As far as the supplier goes, and this is usually the mill that incurs these costs, they have overhead, machinery, processes. That includes account reps and admins who have to track all the work in progress and answer the countless of mindless emails that they receive every day asking about the status of colors. Time is certainly involved in this overall process. Time is super important to a mill. Courier fees, the big problem, the payment that mills face to send these things out. The courier companies must love the apparel industry because of the amount of revenue that they generate from us. And then there's finally there's this concept of lost revenue. The longer a development process is, the longer it takes to get to production where you're actually generating revenue. So if your mill is sitting around idle, if it takes a long time to get from development to production, then they're losing opportunity to make money by producing fabric for sale. So let's look at some numbers for color exploration. We'll take that Brand X, and I'll share with you some of the numbers that I found that they were spending. Start off with the methodology for Brand X, and for the brands, what I'm recommending here is add up the salaries of the people that are involved in color design. This may be, full-time dedication to color. It may be an allocated part of someone's responsibilities, and perhaps 20%, perhaps 40% of their time is spent on color. But it's important to understand the impact of color across the organization, not just on people with color in their title. This also involves support staff, the people who clean up the mess after the design group is finished. These assets have to be organized and filed and kept in good order to be usable. Document your travel expenses. This is fairly simple. Your flight costs, your lodging, meals, entertainment costs, everything that's associated with travel to explore color. Document the costs of the resources used for color. Office space, you may not think of that, but it takes space for these resources to be kept for the people to work in. And if it's not used for a color team, it's probably used for someone else. So it's a fixed cost that needs to be accounted for. The various color resources, whether they're commercial color sets or whatever, the replenishment of those, everybody seems to want to have a copy of these little chippy things. The color standards themselves, you've got to pay for those. Someone is going to be evaluating a lab against a color standard, so how do you get those? And then there's been this recent trend, the spectral data, the underlying data that defines the color. that used to come with color standards when you worked with a standards provider, but now there's a tendency for it to be sold separately. And then document the cost of the equipment. This includes things like spectrophotometers, which you would expect. There are usually maintenance contracts with them to make sure that they are in precise working order every year. Light boxes and the calibration that's required for their annual maintenance. But also consider your inkjet printers that you use to print color printouts for color displays. Those aren't cheap in and of themselves, but the consumables, the inks and the paper, also add a lot of cost. Perhaps your department is covered under a corporate budget, but it's important to try to work with your accounts payable and figure out how much of that is actually going to service color. And finally, look at your timeline, your time and action calendar, your product development calendar. How much time in that calendar is devoted to color? Whether it's in trend forecasting, whether it's in setting up palettes, whether it's in reviewing colors or proving them, whatever, there is time set aside. And since color is an important product attribute, this timeline is usually pretty big because it's split up into a few different sections of the calendar. So let's look at Brand X, the numbers that they came up with. For color exploration, they were spending nearly $500,000, $492,000 to cover the various things that we discussed. People, they have a colorist, they allocate certain portions of other designers' time to color, and then they have admins organizing things. So about $260,000, over $250,000 devoted to people for this process. Travel, back before COVID, they were traveling about $24,000 a year to various places to be inspired by color. Their resources, their space, the color service books, the rings and little swatchy things, the spectral data, the color standards, it amounted to about $171,000. Now, a lot of these expenses are recurring. Color service books, you don't buy them every year, but the recommendation amongst the providers is to buy them every 5 years because they tend to fade, change color over time. The rings and swatch replenishment, that's ongoing. Equipment, they bought a new spectrophotometer and light booth, so the CapEx expense, they didn't pay the maintenance fees for that year, but in coming years they will. And their time. Over the course of their development calendar, there are 8 months associated with color activities. So that's kind of a long time when you think about it. I mean, add another month, you have a baby. But 8 months was devoted to color, and they thought it was time well spent because they recognize the importance of the right color. So we've moved out of color exploration. What about costs associated with color specification? Well, here's a methodology we looked at. It's fairly simple. It takes some digging to get these numbers, but it's pretty straightforward. What are the volume of lab dips processed by the brand? And fairly simple to calculate. You go into your PLM system or your system of record. You see how many colors were associated with fabrics used in bombs for a given season. In this case, that equals the number of solid color match requests. Now, we're not talking about heathers. We're not talking about prints. We're only talking about solid colors. So the number of solid color match requests, and then you have to multiply that by the number of times you have to go back and forth with the mill with lab dips to get an approval. So every time you reject a lab dip, that's 1 round. So we want the total number of solid color match requests times the number of rounds to get to approval. That equals the total number of lab dip rounds processed in a year. That's a standard measurement that we can look at because it repeats year over year. Now, once we have those requests out there, you have to acknowledge it takes time to process a lab dip request. And there are multiple people involved, there are multiple activities involved, all the way from generating that lab dip request in the first place to going down to the mailroom, picking that stuff up, filing, retrieving old rejected lab dips, getting all the people that need to be at the light box. Once you make a decision, documenting the decision in the system, communicating it back to the supply chain, and then filing stuff again. So we don't follow people around with stopwatches, but a reasonable estimate that includes all of these activities is 30 minutes per round of lab dips. So we take the volume of lab dips processed, we multiply it by that time it takes to process a lab dip, and we have an idea of the amount of time a brand devotes to color over the course of a year. So the results for brand X, 9,562 hours a year spent on looking at lab dips. Now, that's only a portion. Their total number of solid color lab dip requests was higher than this, but we factored out, since LEDSimulator is talking about managing appearance, which is due to texture, we just want to look at how many of those nearly 32,000 lab dip requests were for textured fabric. Well, 20%. And so that gave us a number of 6,375 lab dip requests on textured fabric. This is stuff that doesn't go through a digital process. This is stuff that requires manual visual assessment. The number of rounds to approval, we ran numbers. On average, it was 3. So the total number of lab dip rounds that had to be evaluated for textured colors in 1 year was 19,125. Well, now let's see the impact of time. Multiply that times 30 minutes, and you have 9,562 hours, or 1,195 days, the equivalent of over 4 dedicated full-time employees. Now, companies generally don't work that way. They don't have people who do nothing but color, and nor does the activity work that way. It's not like there's a never-ending second-to-second workload of color. But over the course of a year, that's the amount of time that employees of a company spend on tasks related to a conventional color process. So let's move into color production. Now we start to see the impact on the mill. We're going to use some of those same numbers, and we're going to run them a slightly different way. So we want to know the volume of lab dips created, how many of those requests come through, and we're still interested in the number of times to get to approval. So that number we use for the brands, we're going to carry over and use for the mills as well. Understanding that we're calculating this for the entire mill matrix. This isn't one mill at a time, unless you happen to only work with one mill, but you don't. So this is a cost to the mill matrix. Now, we're going to multiply it by a different number. In the industry, there's a good estimate of the cost of a lab dip being about $100. Every time you ask a mill to generate a lab dip, they've got to absorb about $100 of costs that involve their overhead, their administrative work, their whip tracking, those god-awful courier fees, the communication back and forth, and various other expenses. So they're absorbing about $100 of cost to comply with the conventional lab dip process. So we can come up with this number. We can multiply the volume of lab dips created times that cost, times that $100, to give us what the mills are absorbing to comply with a conventional lab dip process. So results for brand X. For their textured fabrics alone, their mills were absorbing nearly $2 million in costs, $1,912,500 to process lab dips on textured fabrics back and forth and back and forth. The mill overhead, here again, $100. That's a lot of money that is being generated but not adding value. There's no doubt that the designer choosing the right color adds true value to the brand, but this repetitive tasks of swapping, negotiating lab dips back and forth, it's hard to make the case that that adds value. So how do we save? How do we impact these costs with LEDSimulator? Well, we know again that color is super important. It's a value-adding product attribute. We know that color exploration is the right time to do that work. It's choosing the right color at the beginning and flowing it through the process. So that exploration process requires the right tools to identify that color. That tool itself is going to make your designer more creative, because instead of searching for that unknown color in other stores and secondhand stores and paint stores, God knows where, they actually have a tool that they can use to explore and find that right color. So the case we're making is the money spent during color exploration is money well spent. It's adding value. But the money being spent in those other two phases, color specification and color production, can be reduced. When we see an efficient process come up, then we look for opportunities to cut costs. So how can this happen? What would be the impact of an improvement in these processes? Well, we can't do much about how much time it takes to round up people at the brand. 30 minutes is 30 minutes. Maybe we get it down to 25 minutes. What we can impact is the number of rounds that we go back and forth with the mill on. So if we specify color better at the beginning, if we actually set a true definition of what we expect so that we don't go after these color as a starting point, but color as a specification, and if we give the right data to the mills to match that color within a given tolerance, then we're able to take time out of this number of rounds to approval. If we save 25% there, that gives us nearly 300 days of time back to the brand. In this case, at brand X, saving, reducing their rounds to approval by 25% would give them back 300 days. It would save their mill matrix nearly $500,000, reduced courier fees, overhead, time, many things that would impact the efficiency of a mill. If we went to 33%, if we cut one round out, we went from 3 to 2, then brand X would they would get nearly 400 days back, and they would get about $631,000 in savings to the mill. Now that's meaningful. That's by eliminating one round of lab dips. And finally, if they were to cut it in half, if they were to cut the rounds to approval by half, so you get an average of 1.5, that's basically 600 days of time back to the brand, back to the various people who are involved in color. It's time that they're spending on more value-adding activities. Perhaps they're doing one more go at a design that makes it perfect. Perhaps they're involved and they get a creative inspiration in some time that they were spending not looking at silly lab dips in a light box. The mills themselves would get nearly $1 million of savings. And when you think about fabric accounts for about 60% of the cost of goods. Again, brands don't own the mills, but if you take $1 million of costs out of the process, then you're likely to get many things. Better quality, perhaps a bargaining tool with cost reductions from the mills. Perhaps. But at any rate, you have the brand and the supply chain working together to eliminate inefficiency. So yes, our position is you can hit these KPIs. You can enable your designers to leverage their skill and talent to choose better colors. You can drive efficiency and cut waste of time out of the process so that designers are doing things that they're employed to do, designing. You can reduce that waste, that overhead to the mills, and with that extra time, the mills can increase their throughput, the revenue driving products that they create. And finally, and most importantly, the quality of the products that your customers are buying will be higher, because when you do things right, you have a better chance of meeting the specification, which is a definition of quality. So thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I hope it's generated some ideas. We're certainly willing to talk about this and share these metrics with you so that you can go back and do some financial analysis of your own organization. Thank you.